el río Tolten había una china lavando su chamal.
American intervention in Vietnam, repression in South America, civil rights in Germany. Those were the subjects of previous Russell tribunals. The judges had no legal authority and they can only give moral indictments. But those are precisely the tribunal aim, moral impact on public opinion. It is set up to adjust a failing international law system. The jury of the Russell Tribunal elected Mario Juruna, the famous Brazilian Indian leader, as their president. The FUNAI, the Brazilian government organizations for Indian affairs, refused Juruna his passport. Juruna, they said, was unable to make statements about other nations. Besides, Juruna was legally, as all other Brazilian Indians, minor of age. Mr. Juruna, with a lawyer, started a process against the FUNAI. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the lower court refused Mr. Juruna's plea. With the help of several deputies and attorneys, Mr. Juruna brought his case to the Supreme Court. Time was running out as the tribunal has already started.
People are being driven from their homelands and forced to live in poverty and despair on the margins of their rightful territories as exiles in their own land.
O Vale do Guaporé é vale de terras muito ricas no estado do Mato Grosso. A partir da década de 60, o governo brasileiro e a Fundação Nacional do Índio autorizaram grupos empresariais a instalarem empresas agropecuárias de grande vulto na região e financiando a instalação desses grupos empresariais. Como o contato direto desses grupos empresariais com os índios levou uma grande mortalidade desses índios e a questão ganhou alguma publicidade, transferiu esses índios para um deserto de 1 milhão de hectares, né? E essa transferência normalmente fracassou, que os índios passaram fome e voltaram por conta própria para o vale. Novamente, o governo tentou transferir esses índios para o sul do vale. Novo fracasso, novas mortes, e os índios, também por motivos religiosos, voltaram cada um em suas localizações, onde muitas vezes já estavam abertos fazendas, campos de aviação, exatamente no local onde eles tinham suas malocas. Agora, está se desmatando exatamente onde os índios estão, né, deliberadamente.
Por que deliberadamente?
Para desalojar definitivamente os índios. Uma pessoa como um fazendeiro considera realmente, ele é convicto disso, né? Ele acha que o Canambiquara é sujo, ele acha que o Canambiquara não é gente, quer dizer, que está é um bicho.
A direct result of the Russell Tribunal and the international opinion was the verdict of the Brazilian Supreme Court. The interpretation of the Brazilian constitutional law was definitely revised. From now on, the FUNAI could only assist the Indians to help express their wishes and, if possible, help to execute them.
The tribunal denounced the transnational corporations which exploit our resources, destroying at the same time the ecology of our territories, and for which they count upon the complicity of governments as their instruments of repression.
Tropical mission to leave the country in order to attend the fourth Russell Tribunal.
Olha, a primeiro passaporte único que o brasileiro estava conseguindo para vir assistir julgamento da tribunal. mas é grande vitória, para mim já é caminho para a comunidade brasileira. Ação que qualquer branco que a gente vive na cidade, o índio não leva nada a vingança para branco. O índio está vivendo no seu lugar, está cuidando da sua terra, e está procurando para sustentar a família, e porque que branco procura para poder invadir a terra do índio. Será o índio também já procurou, também já levou a vingança para branco? Índio é generoso, índio é muito bom, índio quer receber a visita, índio quer agradar a visita, e não sei por que a gente não pode agradecer o índio.
No segundo caso, apresentado ante o tribunal, a acusação é feita contra a FUNAI, o órgão burocrático do governo brasileiro destinado nominalmente a proteger os índios.
That there was a violation with respect to the Indians' right to control their natural resources and economic development.
El gobierno de Romeo
protected
Lucas
by
García
other
ha
international
cometido actos de genocidio contra los pueblos nativos de Guatemala y es culpable de negar sistemáticamente los derechos humanos básicos del pueblo indígena, por lo que llamamos a los organismos internacionales apropiados.
O governo brasileiro e a FUNAI são acusadas aí formalmente de genocídio e etnocídio com base na legislação
nacional. El gobierno
nacional
colombiano
e
ha
internacional.
interferido en la vida de la comunidad de Puracé al reducir la cantidad de tierra del resguardo y llevarla
The actions of the
hasta
United
límites
States and the
de la
state of New
Acorrala.
York directed against the Mohawk Nation and its traditional government
Perú,
violate
el
certain
respeto
provisions of
a los
international
derechos
law.
de los campas y el amparo a sus derechos históricos
Haudenosaunee
al uso,
Confederacy.
posesión y
The
propiedad.
accused in that case, the United States of America,
We
the
find
state of
that
New
the United
York,
States government has
and the
deceived
St.
and lied
Regis
to the Hopi
Mohawk
people,
Tribal
and that
Council.
action violates the right of the Hopi people to know and act on those things which they are
the
entitled
seizure
to.
of
as
Indian
enunciated
lands in
principle.
violation.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Cassandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cassandra, for your excellent interpreting, as usual. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nilo Cayuqueo. I'm from the Mapuche people of Argentina. I welcome you all. So it is a great honor for me to moderate the first segment of this international webinar, which has been organized by the Netherlands Center for Indigenous Peoples and DOSIP and dialogue amongst nations as well as other organizations, along with the help of indigenous peoples from all over the world. Some of us who are veterans who were part of the original Fourth Russell Tribunal in 1980. In 1977, some of us traveled to Geneva. We were, quote unquote, discovering Europe. And then we worked together with our allies to convene the Fourth Russell Tribunal on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the Americas. It was a tremendous success and had a very distinguished jury and very important witnesses. The jury included Eduardo Galeano, Guillermo Bonfil Batallas, Stefano Varesi, Darcy Rivero, and others. Some of them are no longer with us, and some of them are still with us. So we have a very ambitious agenda today, and we're going to speak about crucial issues. So I will be keeping time and letting the panelists know when they have a minute or two left. So the Fourth Russell Tribunal was a historic occurrence and a tremendous success. These three international webinars that we've organized to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Fourth Russell Tribunal have also been very successful. And we know that many of the violations of Indigenous peoples' rights that were denounced 40 years ago are still happening today. There's global warming, there's multinational corporations that are pillaging our territories, and there's violations against our rights to healthcare and to education. And there are extractive industries and fossil fuel companies that are mining and drilling and burning fossil fuels that are causing climate change. So, Juan Leon, are you with us?
Buenas, buenas.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Well, today is a very special day. Thank you so much for giving me the floor and including me in this webinar. Today in the Maya calendar is the Imosh. Imosh is about craziness and extremes, but applied to Mother Earth. It is a day of water and clouds and the dew and the mist. It's very important to think of our veins, the veins of our bodies, because they're analogous with the rivers and streams of Mother Earth. And instead of blood, she has water. Our head is important. It's the center of our thinking and how we speak and how we come together and how we have meetings like this one. And we wouldn't be anything without our head. So we thank our ancestors and our elders and the four directions for being with us today. And today in the Maya calendar is about our connection with water. And so I wish blessings upon this third international webinar celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Fourth Russell Tribunal. And I ask that our minds be blessed. And I suggest that we drink a lot of water to replenish our bodies, but especially to replenish our minds. Thank you so much, Juan Leon. I hope you'll stay tuned and be here with us. We're hoping that you will bless the closing of our gathering too. So now we're going to show a video. Unfortunately, one of our brothers from Brazil couldn't, Alton Krenak, who was in the original tribunal, couldn't be with us today. So we're going to hear a video from Álvaro Tucano, who was a witness at the original Fourth Russell Tribunal in 1980 in Holland. And he has sent us a video greeting. Álvaro Tucano has been in the struggle for decades. He's been jailed, he's received death threats, he's suffered repression, he's been on the front lines for many years. So thank you, Álvaro Tucano, for sending this video. And now let's hear his message. Elise, can you kindly screen the video of Álvaro? I'm Álvaro Tucano. I'm from the Japamasa people, also known as the Tucana people. We're found in Colombia and Brazil and the Amazon, and I'm one of the indigenous leaders that was a witness to the Fourth Russell Tribunal in 1980. On November 24th, 1980, I spoke before the tribunal. The jury elected Mario Jorunha as the president of the tribunal, Brazilian indigenous leaders who wasn't allowed by the Brazilian government to travel to the tribunal, but afterwards he did manage to get that permission and traveled and was with us. We were young leaders, and I presented the case of Rio Negro about the Salesian mission that was taking over our lands. I'm still in the struggle. I'm still battling. Back in 1980, we had the Union of Indigenous Nations in Brazil, which was the umbrella organization that we used to defend our rights. And we struggling. What are some of the concrete outcomes of the tribunal in Brazil and other Latin American countries? Well, let's see. We got rid of the military dictatorships, and we got rid of the Salesian mission in Rio Negro that was taking over our land. The missionaries that were troubling us have died. I prepared this message because Nilo asked me to, and it reminded me that back then we were really united as an indigenous movement, and we had a lot of summits and important meetings, and we need to continue to have unity and forge alliances. We need to have new leaders that think like the old leaders, that are loyal, that defend the rainforests and indigenous peoples and our rights. Brazil is really in a very difficult situation right now. We're saddened to see the terrible forest fires. But all of these abuses are not happening because we don't have a legal framework. We've got a good legal framework. The problem is that the laws are dead letter. We need our rights to be implemented. So we need to have strong leadership that act to defend our rights and to organize our peoples and also to forge strong alliances. Back in the day, we had huge summits of indigenous peoples, and we met in meetings like Rio Plus 20 and to defend the environment. So I think that it's really important that we believe in ourselves and continue to defend the rights of indigenous peoples and the rights of Mother Earth. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Alvaro. Sorry, I turned my mic off during the video. Obviously, the situation of indigenous peoples in Brazil is very dire right now. We can't go into detail about that right now, but we are going to include in our final report information about the struggle of indigenous peoples in Brazil right now. Good afternoon. Here is the daughter of Alvaro Tucana. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you and learning about the history of our fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers. My father presented the case of Rio Negro to the Fourth Russell Tribunal. We were denouncing the boarding schools of the Catholic Church, which since the beginning of the 20th century took indigenous children away from their families and prohibited them from speaking their language and practicing their culture. So my father presented the case of Rio Negro to the tribunal and condemned the genocide being committed by the Salesian mission. And fortunately, the boarding schools have been closed, and the new schools do not prohibit indigenous children from speaking their language or practicing their culture. And so there's a new generation that doesn't suffer what my father suffered. In the 1980s, we managed to get a new constitution in 1984, which enshrines the rights of indigenous peoples and their rights to their culture and practices. And it stipulated that the Brazilian government had to recognize and demarcate all of the indigenous people's territories, but now only 30% of indigenous territories in Brazil have been properly titled and demarcated. A lot of indigenous peoples are living in urban areas. there are about 1 million indigenous peoples in Brazil. Indigenous peoples, lands and territories are being attacked on all sides. By mining companies, gold mining companies, there's drug trafficking and human trafficking and agro business. But nonetheless, we are committed to defending the rights that were enshrined in the Constitution of 1984. Thank you so much for your words. We will include them in the final report. A big hug to all of you in Brazil. Thank you so much. Now it's my honor to present Jeanette Armstrong. Are you there, Jeanette?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
How about you? I'm going to say a few words in English. Buenos días. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce Janet. I know her for many years, and we have been together in many in 1994 during the Zapatista uprising. We organized an indigenous delegation to support our brothers and sisters in Mexico, and Janet played a very important role in that journey. Janet is a PhD, is a fluent speaker and traditional knowledge keeper of the ancient territory side of Okanagan people. She collaborates with and actively support of indigenous people in the protection of their rights and in the work to reestablish their language, their historical relationship, their full resource ceremonies throughout gathering, caring relationship and action in protection of Juarez land and food sovereignty. She has served many purposes. She currently serves on the board of the Swiss Family Foundation. Throughout her role as a Canada Research Chair in Psych Indigenous Technology at University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and her role as the Vice President of the Enokin Center, the Institute of Higher Learning of the Okanagan Nation, she has collaborated to institute a unique degree in Psych Okanagan language to serve the community in the recovery of their rights, knowledge, and practices. He is a recipient of the Eco Trust USA Buffett Award in Indigenous Leadership and serves on Canada's Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee of Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife Canada. Janet, you are very welcome. Take the floor, please.
Good morning. I'm going to speak a few moments in my language. Yayati bisnaksil it'll autim kusakala. I give you greetings from our people here in the Okanagan. I'm not going to speak very long because I'm really wanting to give more attention to those that were part of the 4th Russell Tribunal. And I congratulate all of you that put this webinar series together. It's such an important topic that people are reminded of it and people remember what took place because it's the foundation of all of the things that are happening now in many countries. Here in Canada, in terms of some of the reconciliation, although so much is still yet to be done. I was really moved this morning to see John Mohawk in the video and others in the video. And I just wanted to mention that the tremendous work that many of you have done and are doing now, give you all of our prayers, and if we can, we try to move and mobilize attention to it, and or we try to go there whenever we can. We also are working here in Canada to try to support the people at the local level whose rights are being diminished and demolished, and their lands are being devastated by pipelines and all of the things that are happening to them that all of you know as the struggle. I just wanted to mention before I introduce Sharon Venn, who I want to give as much time to speak, that I also served on the First Nations International Court of Justice, along with John Mohawk, and along with a number of other people like Tupac Enrique Gonzalez, who was also on along with myself and representatives from New Zealand and Australia and the US that spoke as judges on that international panel, taking Canada to court, and in terms of its violations against people in Ontario and other parts of Canada. So I did want to mention that. I'm going to now introduce Sharon because I'd like to have her have as much time. I've known Sharon since back in the late 80s. And I've known her as one of the people who has worked so hard for our people here to bring justice in the eyes of the law. So I'm going to introduce her now. Dr. Sharon Venn is a Cree woman and is also by marriage a member of the Blood Tribe within Treaty 7. She's an accomplished lawyer and internationally recognized advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples. She has written numerous articles and edited materials related to the rights of Indigenous peoples globally, and has lectured in Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, France, Italy, Hawaii, US, and Canada. She has worked at the United Nations prior to the establishment of the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples in 1982. And the background research to the many clauses on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is included in her book, Our Elders Understand Our Rights, Evolving International Law Regarding Indigenous Peoples, which was published in 1996 and published by Thetis Books, by the way, that's owned by the Okanagan Nation. Sharon worked to secure a UN study on treaties from the first introduction of the resolution in 1983 until the report was finalized in 1999. She worked to ensure that the report reflected Indigenous laws and norms. She has recently published in 2018, Manufactured Consent, How State Governments Manufacture Consent and Use It Against Indigenous Nations at the Domestic and International Level, in a book edited by Dr. Irene Watson. And so, Sharon, you have the floor, and I give you my greetings and my love from here where we're at in Penticton in what's called British Columbia and what's called Canada, but you're right here in Seal territory with me today. And thank you, Neela, for everything that you're doing and everybody else that organized this.
Thank you, Janet. Sharon?
Buenas noches. Is that the right word? Good evening.
All right.
I don't know
Here
where
we
people
are.
are, so I'm saying hello, good
Here we
afternoon,
are.
good morning, tanse. Thank you very much. Whoever organized all this, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I was an accidental participant in the original Russell Tribunal in 1980. George Manuel, who was the president at that time of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, was the one that was invited to make the presentation at the Russell Tribunal, and we had worked on a presentation from the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs on what was going on in Canada at that time. And unfortunately, George had a heart attack shortly before he had to travel. And so he asked me to go and make the presentation on his behalf because I had authored the report to the tribunal. So I went to Rotterdam on behalf of the Union of British Columbia Chiefs to present. At that time was a very turbulent time in Canada, and we were organizing on many levels. Domestically, there was a huge effort to organize what they referred to as the Constitutional Express, which was a train that went across Canada to Ottawa of Indigenous peoples. And so we're organizing in the communities. And then we're also organizing internationally. And the Russell Tribunal was an opportunity for the people to bring their case to the international community, in addition to the work that was going on in England at the time, because Canada was going to go to the British government to ask for its constitution, because Canada is not an independent entity. It was created by the British Parliament, the Imperial Parliament. And so they wanted to become more independent from England. And so they were talking about going to the Imperial Parliament. And as Indigenous peoples were saying, just a second here, we have rights as Indigenous peoples. This is our territory. There's no conquest. There's no discovery. There's no terra nullius. We're here. We've always been here. And so you cannot do what you're planning to do without our consent. And so that's the work that we were doing, and that's what was included in the documents that were filed in Rotterdam at the Russell Tribunal, to bring attention to what was really going on in Canada, because I think internationally people think that Canada is this great place, and that everybody should be coming here. And Bono said at one point there should be another. What the world needs more now is another Canada or more Canadas. And I thought, oh my God, no, that's the last thing we need, because if you look at what they're doing to our territories, they're destroying our land and our peoples with it, and all the things that we wrote in the document from 1980 is still happening. They're still trying to enforce their laws on our people, and they're trying to push us out of the way. And they've got this new buzzword called reconciliation, which is really rubbish. In our language, my Cree language, there is no word for reconciliation. So this is kind of a top-down federal government idea of what should be happening. And so we have to always constantly remind the international community that we're still here, and we have never been allowed to decolonize. We have never been allowed to use the mechanisms that other Indigenous or other people should be allowed to use, because we are Indigenous. And that's the systemic racism that exists at the international level. And the one thing that the Russell Tribunal did was it focused attention on what was going on with Indigenous peoples across the Americas, and other places in the world that the colonizers have come and tried to dispossess us. And they're still trying to dispossess us, because they have created these entities called states on our territories without our consent. And so now they have these entities, and they're trying to force us to in a complete violation of our rights, and in violation of all rights of peoples to self-determination, which they don't like us to talk about, because they say that you can't have self-determination because why can't we have it? Well, they have all kinds of excuses. But in the document that we submitted at the Russell Tribunal, it was about what was going on in Canada at the time, that we were worried and concerned that Canada would try to gain its independence from Great Britain without acknowledgement of the rights of our Indigenous nations. And we were lucky enough and fortunate enough in 1982 to have a decision of the courts in England that said that there is the honor of the crown that still exists, that they cannot enter our territory without our consent. And so that's, I always tell people that the Constitution may have come from Canada, came to Canada, or something came to Canada in 1982, but there was a rider on it, and that rider was Indigenous peoples. And so we continue to ride on our right of self-determination. And it was because of that, that we felt, that we knew that we have a right of self-determination. We created an international court of, our own international court of justice. We said, this is an Indigenous First Nations International Court of Justice, and we invited people from the 4 directions to come to Turtle Island and talk about what this justice really means. And that's why we, set it in place and had people come and make presentations about our own legal systems and that they're still here, they're still operating, and that we have never given up our right and obligations to our territories, and that these continue regardless of what the states are saying. I mean, I'm talking about the state of Canada or the United States or Australia, New Zealand, all these different states in South and Central America are saying this is still our territory, and we still have obligations, responsibilities. So that, that's basically where we're coming from in 1980. That's where we're still coming from in 2020. I just want to say that I was really, really happy this morning, or for me it's morning, for to hear people speaking in the Spanish language. I have such great memory of hearing the people that come from South and Central America, because we so far north on Turtle Island, it's very seldom that we hear what's going on in the south of us. Although we know about it, we don't hear the people directly. So when you hear them and you see them, it's always it makes me very happy to be able to hear that, because at one point we worked very closely together, and it was because of our work together that we managed to make the Karaoke Declaration in 1992 in before the Rio conference. And we, there was a declaration that we wrote together, and it was based on a presentation made by David Yalmami, when he said that we walk to the future in the footprints of our ancestors. And that was the beginning line of the Karaoke Declaration. And that's the same, sentiment that came out of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, that George Emanuel, who really wanted to be there and wasn't able to, he says, I just want to quote from him, he says, "We have never ever given up through agreement or legislation our Aboriginal rights to control our own lives and the means to live." And I think that we're still trying to achieve that. But it's not a goal or an aspiration. It's our responsibility as Indigenous people. So thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I didn't go over the time limit. And it's so good to see everybody. I'm really happy. I know it's a sad day, but it's a really happy day too, because a lot of people that were there at that time are no longer with us, and we miss them and we treasure them and think about them. But we have to think about the future generations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Really, really enjoyed seeing you and hearing your words again. You're such a strong woman. I'm going to hand it over now back to Stefano.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone. It's my turn now to pick up the coordination or the moderation of this wonderful family gathering, kin gathering, to introduce a wonderful indigenous leader, Patricia Walinga. Patricia, are you listening to me? Can you hear me? Patricia.
Sí, les escucho perfectamente. Buenas tardes.
Gracias.
Yes, good afternoon. I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Patricia Walinga pertenece a una...
Patricia Walinga.
I'm sorry, I can hear myself in English. I don't... Let me check out
A ver.
Oh. Okay, Patricia Walinga pertenece a un linaje...
Patricia Walinga is part of a very powerful lineage of the sacred Quechua people from the Napo River in the Amazon of Ecuador. One of the founders of her lineage was a wise medicine man who had many children, sons and daughters, who are blessed with the wisdom of the Amazonian rainforest. Patricia is part of generations of Quechua who have contributed a great deal to indigenous conceptual framework. For example, Suma Causa, this indigenous counterpoint to sustainable development, which means living the good life, Suma Causa in Quechua. And Suma Causa has been poorly translated into English as the good life or good living, but it represents a very holistic well-being. So I'm going to give
lately a disastrous flooding in the lower part of the community of Sarayaku, and also has been impacted terribly by the COVID that we are all suffering from. So, welcome, Patricia. The floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. For me, it's an honor to be here amongst such eminent and impressive leaders of indigenous peoples, some of whom were part of the Russell Tribunal. I'm honored to be amongst you. I'm going to say a few words about the struggle of my community, Sarayaku, which has been resisting for 508 years, that hasn't changed even though our faces change. And we know that colonialism also doesn't really change, though its face changes. Now we have the extractive industries and the oil companies breathing down our neck. So Sarayaku has resisted throughout history, and we've defended ourselves and our territory based on our traditional knowledge systems. We organized from the very beginning to defend our autonomy and our self-government and our council of government. We're here in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and we've always said no to oil drilling and mining and no to highway construction. So I want to share with you the struggle of my people. It's an ongoing struggle that never ends. In 1992, we finally won the titling and demarcation of our territory. And so they had just handed us the deeds to our land when they started auctioning off the oil concessions to oil companies to drill. And the first block of oil that was auctioned off was block 23. And everybody told us, oh, it's impossible to win against an oil company and against multinational corporations. But nonetheless, we did. After months of struggle deep in the rainforest, and even though the oil company left behind over a ton of explosives for even though they militarized our territory and criminalized our leaders, we won an important battle, but the struggle went on. We had a court case in the Inter-American Human Rights Court that lasted 10 years. First, we presented our complaints to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and then it finally was accepted by the court. And we won in the court. We won, and we showed that the Ecuadorian government had violated our right to free, prior, informed consent and other rights of indigenous peoples and the peoples of Sarayaku. We proved that we never granted our free, prior, informed consent and that our rights had been violated. And the court ruled that free, prior, informed consent is a fundamental principle of international law, and that determines what can and cannot be done in indigenous peoples' territories. Furthermore, the court ruled that the Ecuadorian government had to pass a law on indigenous peoples' rights in consultation with indigenous peoples, and that it needed to act in good faith. The other part of the ruling which hasn't been implemented is that they had to come and remove the 1.5 tons of explosives that the oil company left behind. But they haven't done that, even though the ruling was 7 years ago. So other chapters of our struggles have included advocacy in the media, but the key points have been kicking out the oil company and the military and winning the lawsuit against the Ecuadorian state. And Sarayaku is really a torch in our region. It inspires other indigenous peoples to resist extractive industries and oil companies, and that other peoples rise up and defend their territories. And since we established this legal precedent in the Inter-American Human Rights Court and created this new jurisprudence for indigenous peoples, it has been very important for indigenous peoples from other countries. And so, for example, a judge in Guatemala recently cited this precedent in his ruling. But unfortunately, even in Ecuador, indigenous peoples' right to free, prior, informed consent is not being respected. There is gold mines that have been imposed on indigenous peoples' territories without their consent. And there are all kinds of justifications for violating our rights, but we now explain the rights of indigenous peoples in terms of the right to life of everyone, because when we defend our territories, when we defend the Amazon, we're defending the right to life of everybody. And we have a new struggle to defend our living rainforests. And Sasha, the Causa Sasha, which is the living rainforest. So we're defending all the life in the Amazon. We're defending the nature and our home. And we know that nature is a living being, and that is what Sarayaku is defending. We can't isolate ourselves. There are too many threats. The colonialism continues, but the world has to understand that indigenous peoples are not just defending our own rights. We're defending the very future of humanity and Mother Earth. The Amazon is one of the most important sources of surface fresh water in the world. So that's what we want to tell the world, that when we defend our territories, we are defending you. And if they destroy the Amazon, they're also destroying you. And that it's not just a question of committing genocide against indigenous peoples. It's a crime against all of humanity. And this transcends the geography. Everything is interconnected. The Amazon is connected to the North Pole. And we are part of maintaining the balance of the world. So this is what we're doing. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you a bit about our struggle. I'm honored to be among you. Thank you so much, Patricia. We always learn so much from Sarayaku and from you and your family. The beauty of Sarayaku's struggle always shines so bright. And we know that all that you do is for a better world for all of us. I've had the pleasure of visiting Sarayaku a number of times, and I know the Qualingua family well. So it was great to hear from you. Thank you so much to all of you who have been helping us to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the 4th Russell Tribunal. And now I believe that Natalie Dresch,
Natalie Drache will introduce Leonor Salavata Torres, or a video clip of Leonor Salavata Torres, and the connection of Leonor Salavata Torres with the Russell Tribunal and the struggle of indigenous people of Latin America and the Americas in general. So, Natalie Drache, are you here?
Sí, Stefano, soy presente. Aquí estoy. Quiero
Yes,
empezar
Stefano, here I
agradeciendo a
am.
todos
I want to
por
begin by
sus palabras
thanking
esa mañana
each and
y
every
lo
one
que
of you
han
for your
compartido,
words
y
this
la verdad
morning.
es que quedo
Thank you for
completamente
sharing.
emocionada
I
por
am
lo que
truly
he escuchado
moved
esa mañana y
by
en
what
los
I've heard
otros dos webinars.
today, as
Pues
well
no sé
as in
si
the
Leonor
previous
está con
webinars. So
nosotros
I don't
hoy.
know
En
if
fin, me voy
Leonor
a
is
hacer
here
mi
with
introducción,
us,
que
but
ahora
I'm going
tengo
to
el privilegio de
introduce
presentarles
her
a Leonor
nonetheless.
Zalabata Torres.
Leonor Zalabata Torres,
Zalabata, una indígena arhuaca que lucha
is
desde
a
hace más de
Arhuaca
40
indigenous
años
woman who
por
has
la
struggled for
conservación
over
y las
40
costumbres
years
y tradiciones
to
culturales de
defend
su
the
pueblo y
culture and
sus
traditions
condiciones
of
de
her
la salud,
people
educación y
and
calidad de vida.
their health care
Leonor
and
Zalabata,
quality of life.
liderazgo,
Leonor Zalabata
representante
is a
arhuaca
leader of
ante la
indigenous
Comisión
peoples in
Nacional de
Colombia
Derechos
and
Humanos de Pueblos
represented
Indígenas de Colombia,
the
reconocida
Arhuaca people
internacionalmente y
in
nacionalmente
the
por
Human
su
Rights
trabajo en la
Commission on Indigenous
pervivencia
Peoples of
y
Colombia.
defensa de la cultura. En sus propias palabras, quiero decir,
In your own
con
words,
profunda indignación y con la
with
dignidad
profound
que tenemos los arhuacos, reafirmo
rage and
nuestra
dignity,
postura de la
she
Confederación Indígena
affirms
Tairona
the
y la posición política
positions of the
histórica de
Confederation
nuestra
of
lucha
the
por el territorio.
Tairona indigenous peoples
Leonor,
of
estoy
Colombia.
encantada de compartir ese momento
Leonor,
juntas.
I am delighted
Después de tantos años, me
to
parece que hemos
share with
conocido por la
you
primera vez en Carioca,
after
en Brasil, en
so many years.
1992.
I think we met in
Bienvenida
Carioca in
y quiero
1992.
decirte que
Welcome,
caminamos juntos,
and I want to say
caminamos
that
juntas
we have
sobre
walked
los hilos de
together.
la justicia. Bienvenida, espero que si no estás con nosotros
In the
hoy,
path of
vamos a ver un pequeño
justice.
video
So if you're
de
not here
tú
with
y
us
la lucha
today,
en tu
we're
pueblo
going to
de
screen
los arhuacas en
the
Colombia.
video we
Muchas
have
gracias.
of you about the
¿Está
Arhuaco
Leonor?
people of Colombia.
Yo sé que
Are
hemos
you
tenido un poco
here,
de problemas, ¿no?
Leonor?
de
I
la
know we've been
comunicación
having
de
a
lejos,
bit
que ella
of
está
a
ahora
tough
en la selva,
time
en la montaña.
to with the internet connection.
Alguien
She lives high in the mountains
cuenta,
of
por favor,
Colombia, and it's
si Leonor está o
it's a little
Elías,
tricky.
por favor, del video.
So I believe we're going to screen the video now. The Tairona.
La nevada es la madre, es un macizo hídrico en el mundo, que la minería no puede existir allí.
Eric Kinkiri, Maadu, Fiji Mibinguanari, Abunan Krazangunan, Chowawadi, Maibi, Kagamadu Kinkiri, Machikimras in Gad, yes, in Gad, Chumibinguanari, Ikri, Kangavi, Pina Junankchi, Ankchi, the Mibinguanari, a jei kat kan mi ka bona una me gum ikse kinki binezani kon ge ki an gwe kinki ma mi kuma nan gonal aju koizi mi gonal ema je mi knana jikari ema je an gwe je ni ka kinki mari e mara mia jina an gwe ni ka chukuma na zungunan kan e wambe zanga e mari a chasu na chuk du chuk e mari je an gwe kinki jununuga zungunan juasia zoinuga e mari juga kak ingga ju wa nak ni ga zungunan be mai ne zun e yan ingwe ima divni kan kinkiri juasia zana gugimi nai kone kinan gunant gugin juane kimina ina ande vita kachana kinuga gunan de imar e imarang wazin panweri biga juna e ma kagumur diungan ni kampanan bichaman kwa kampana vivinza ni kampana iwari jewu jun zempana iwari biga juna wichme pari mayina nenan gananga wanenan e meka divon ni geri inina mika zankuniku kwale meriusa mi achumpano gere ke mari nikunari.
La Sierra Nevada, como madre de nosotros, tiene que ser libre, libre de minería, de represamiento de sus ríos. Y hasta que no tengamos garantía de esos derechos, vamos a permanecer en Valledupar o podemos también estar en Santa Marta o en Riohacha.
Ei mari, como nari, jandwings ngoi mari, ingi aju, kuzari, kamazanasan, ei mari anding, juavi kanari, ei mari lugazangun, juga jinari, e rase e mi gacha, a cuisine zikazan, an gwen bin kanari zin panweri, avec keman gwerigan e maran tarizan, au tari, diwan nisi guzin, zam se diwan di campana, e mi case di un'anzani campana, e mi zacciase di un'anni campana, e mi geuse di un'anni campana, cioè i mami che non guardano azari, e mi che.
Bueno, espero entonces ahora que Leonor tendrá la oportunidad más adelante de escuchar todo ese programa.
Will be able to
Y
hear
en ese momento
our
me voy a
webinar
pasar la palabra
Anon, and now
a
I'm going to give
Elise
the
Miller.
floor
Voy
to
a
Elise
pasar al
Miller,
inglés. Elise
and
Miller
now I'm
is
going
a
to speak
friend of
English.
Franz Eichold. From 1936 to 2020, he has just passed away, just previous to our holding these webinars and bringing attention to this tribunal. And Fons was the main coordinator of the Fourth Russell Tribunal, who collected and edited the original footage as well of the tribunal. And Elise has made a grand effort to organize a lot of the videos that we are presenting within the webinars and will be available for other uses. DOSIP is going to take over a lot of the documentation and digitalization, and we'll have a wider visibility. So I thank everybody so far this morning, and Elise, look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Natalie. Good evening, everybody. And for me, it's a great honor to now introduce to you Frank van Vree. Frank assisted in organizing the tribunal in 1980. He was there right from the beginning and long after the tribunal took place also, because there was a wide variety of activities and lectures going on after the tribunal. Frank was responsible for the communication and media during the tribunal, and he was highly successful in that. He managed to mobilize the press and the media amazingly. There were more than 200 reporters who wrote about the tribunal. So he contributed largely to the success of the tribunal. Frank also worked very closely with Fons Eickholt at that time. Currently, Frank is the director of the NIOD, that's the Institute of War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the Netherlands. And personally, I think maybe if you work every day with stories of war, it's very good to have this inspiration that a single person can really make a difference. Before I shift over to Frank, I'm still going to first show you the last part of the documentary on the tribunal, and it lasts for 7 minutes. Then we'll change over to Frank. Thank you.
The tribunal denounced the transnational corporations which exploit our resources, destroying at the same time the ecology of our territories, and for which they count upon the complicity of governments as their instruments of repression.
And of course, the fourth enemy, and probably the most profound today, is the multinational corporations and how they exploit our land and manipulate our people.
Acusamos al gobierno panameño y a las transnacionales Canadian Javelin, Texas Gulf y Rio Tinto Zinc Corporation por los daños irreparables hechos a nuestros cultivos, plantas, animales y fuentes de agua. El área de exploración y posible explotación afecta a 138 comunidades con más o menos 10.200 personas. Se producirán 180.000 toneladas de cobre ampollado, como dicen, al año. Se utilizarán ríos y fuentes de aguas. Los residuos de la mina, que serán venenosas, piensan echarlos cerca del área. La fundición producirá gases sulfurosos que son veneno también. Acusamos finalmente al gobierno panameño porque en complicidad con las transnacionales mencionadas y con las instituciones financieras Export Development Corporation, Banco Mundial, Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, están poniendo en peligro inminente la desaparición del pueblo Guaymí como nación.
The report said, and I quote, "The Navajo and Hopi country land is considered submarginal for human occupation and advancement by normal standards."
Ironically, land once considered worthless by the United States government, for that reason reserved to Canadian people, have proven to be extremely rich in natural resources.
In 1909, the U.S. Geological Survey discovered coal on Black Mesa, and estimates of strippable coal reserves by strip mining, by surface mining, range from 2 to 8 billion tons.
The problems for the United States became how to get the land back from the Indians.
Police forces were sent in to surround the village and herd the children into school. They were taken to foreign places, and very typically they were forbidden to speak their own language. A few years later, they would be sent back, having missed very important parts of the fine Hopi education. Now, after the children of these people and their children's children have received the same treatment, you have a lot of confused Hopis.
The United States now needed legal control and forced the Indians to elect new leaders, the so-called Indian Tribal Council. The Indians had their own government for thousands of years and refused to vote, their traditional way of disapproval. Indians trained by the Bureau of Indian Affairs are elected, their candidates proposed by the United States government. And soon the new Tribal Council approved leases for exploration of minerals.
In the early 1960s, I believe it was 1961, the Hopi Tribal Council approved a permit for exploration and drilling for coal in the Black Mesa area. In 1976, Dresser Minerals Corporation out of Houston, Texas, secured a permit from both the Navajo and Hopi Tribal Councils to drill and explore for uranium in the northwestern part of the JUA area.
All the whole world is going to have to slow down on technology, because we'll surely destroy ourselves.
We will not accept the history of militarism and genocide against the native people. Nosotros por nuestra parte hemos luchado, nos hemos organizado y estamos en pie de lucha.
The bottom line is land and self-determination.
The right to self-determination must also be applied to the political.
100 jaar zigeuners. We worden voor derde rangs burgers beschouwd. Als honden worden we beschouwd.
The Papua is forced to retreat in the inlands, from where the fight against the colonial and neo-colonial dominators burst out.
These are liberation struggles. These are struggles for survival.
To make us understand that the human being is not superior, but a part of the creation. Well, there is a way that we were going to have to live, but that is decisions of my grandchildren.
Indian people are going to solve Indian problems.
12 years ago, Chief Robert Smallboy fled from depressing reserve conditions. Life on his native Kobima Reserve was a degrading world of welfare handouts, government neglect, alcoholism, suicide, and drug abuse. The white man's world is closing in on Smallboy's band. And on behalf of Chief Robert Smallboy, I request this honorable tribunal to support the chief as he yesterday declared no other options will be considered, and they want to remain where they are.
And so, if we are forced to move, we're just going to remain right where we are. And this is what my pledge is, my motto. I say that too.
That if anyone is going to turn the course of history at this time, it will be the mothers. They will fight because they relate to the family.
And we as mothers of our nations have that responsibility. We as mothers truly have to throw off the yoke of colonization.
We call upon the people of the world to take action to right these horrible wrongs.
To see us as humans who centuries ago organized ourselves into native states, who today conduct ourselves as native states. As the Haudenosaunee, we now have 13 countries that allow us in on our own passports.
We call upon the people of the world to begin to unite, and the place where they need to begin to unite is in those world organizations where the rights of indigenous peoples can become entrenched in a whole new body of international law.
We need you to force your governments to put political pressures on the countries who subjugate us.
We call upon you to help us, to support us, to move with us, and to understand what it is that our objectives are.
We need you, and I'm challenging you as a consumer, to impose trade embargoes and boycotts against the products that come from occupied indigenous countries.
And we call upon the people of the world to work for the rights of indigenous peoples to exist as distinct peoples of the world and to condemn genocide and ethnocide.
Now I would like to give the floor to Frank van Vree. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Alice, thank you very much. Dear friends, queridos amigos, watching these recorded images, watching all these people tonight feels like going down memory lane, back to Rotterdam 40 years ago. I would like to share some impressions with you tonight from these days. But first, let me tell you very short about my own personal involvement. Like some other people present at this webinar, I'm happy to see them again, and I feel a bit like a representative of the then Dutch organizers. I was part of the working group Indigenous People, the Dutch Organizing Committee. I was one of the coordinators for media and communication. We were responsible for publications, for information, for media campaigns, along with organizations everywhere over the globe. During that very week in November 1980, a huge staff of hundreds of people, mainly volunteers, did the real work. Among them, dozens of translators of the European Parliament, for example. Translators of Spanish to English, from English to Portuguese, Spanish to French. We had everything at home, about 40 translators, interpreters. We offered everything. And after November, we were responsible as the organizing committee for the dissemination of its results, of the Russell Tribunal. And I was also involved in that, for example, writing a draft resolution of the European Parliament in 1982. But let me share, as I said, some observations, three to be exact. First, the importance of one man, Fons Eichel. He has been mentioned before tonight and in previous sessions. The man who passed away just a few weeks ago. One person making the difference. Stubborn, straightforward, generous, kind, sometimes mad, extremely driven, working day and night. Someone who could take away people, convince people to do the impossible. Without Fons Eichel, the Fourth Russell Tribunal would never have taken place. Secondly, the Fourth Russell Tribunal was based on a very broad international network in Europe and in the Americas. Committees, representatives of indigenous peoples, scholars, priests, bishops, support committees, a huge range of organizations, some of them collecting money for the cost of the tribunal or to support communities to prepare their cases which they brought for the tribunal during that week in Rotterdam. Committees of lawyers, hundreds of people all over the globe. And I can assure you, to keep everybody together, regardless of all kinds of political and other differences of opinion, was a hell of a job in itself. And nevertheless, we managed to stay together till the week of November in Rotterdam. You really managed to bring people together from all over the world. Third, that the Fourth Russell Tribunal had any impact, indeed, was already clear during that very week. As Elise already said, about 200 international media organizations attended the meetings from all over the world. Its reports brought about debates in many countries, particularly, I have to lift it out, in Brazil, where the Fourth Russell Tribunal and the election of Mario Giruna, the famous Savante Indian activist, his election as president of the Russell Tribunal, who was not allowed to leave the country only halfway the week, was front page news for days. We saw it in the movies earlier this session. Of course, in the course of history, the Fourth Russell Tribunal has been perhaps a little bit more than just a moment, but a moment to be remembered, because I still think it brought about a stronger awareness for the position and the rights of the indigenous people in the Americas and elsewhere, and to enhance the self-confidence and determination of the indigenous people, just by giving voice to them, as Oren Lyons said earlier in one of the earlier sessions. A moment worth to be remembered, exactly what we are doing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's really wonderful to get some inside information how you managed to bring the magic together during the tribunal. it's also really wonderful to hear what the pillars were to make it successful. And yeah, it really brought it to life for me at the moment. So thank you so much for that. And now I would like to give the floor to Joshua Cooper. I'm very honored to introduce him because Joshua was is one of the co-organizers of this webinar, but he's also been very important in keeping us motivated at moments when we weren't too sure about if the webinar would really take shape or form. So we're very grateful for all the effort he has made into assuring that this webinar would take place. Joshua is a lecturer at the University of Hawaii, and he's the director of the Hawaii Institute for Human Rights. Joshua, to you the floor.
Aloha, Elise. Aloha, everyone. It's great to be here today, and it's an honor to be with all of the speakers. I want to also say hello to Sharon. Sharon came and taught a course at the University of Hawaii in 1994, and it was one of the inspirations for me wanting to be more involved globally. So as everyone points out, that we are one family fighting for freedoms and standing up for self-determination around the world. And it's great to be with everyone today. I'd like to introduce today a video featuring Professor Theo van Boven. He was the director of the UN Human Rights Division in Geneva, Switzerland from 1977 to 1982. And that, of course, was that amazing time when Oren shared earlier that indigenous peoples came to the UN for the first time on the invitation of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 1977, and then followed up again in 1981, where they shared the understanding of what it means to take care of our land and our earth. And of course, 1982 is significant because that is when the first UN Working Group on Indigenous Peoples took place. And we observed that this year, commemorating August 9th with Oren, to look back at that amazing first meeting of the working group and what it was able to produce. So I'd like to introduce this video, but from Theo van Boven. And it's fortunate to be able to introduce him because he didn't just participate and play this role. He was even on the CERD committee as late as the turn of the century, and he was then even using new innovative means such as our early warning urgent action to help Aboriginal people. So he spent an entire lifetime, and he's just one example of amazing Dutch diplomacy to make sure that those words on paper mean something. And his book title says it all peoples matter. And I'd like to now introduce that video. Thank you.
I do remember many things about that conference. First of all, I got a telephone call from New York where it was suggested that I should stay away from it. I should not keep a certain distance from this issue of indigenous peoples. I was very much surprised, and I thought, this is not something I expected, and I also responded that I felt it my duty and also my responsibility to make a presentation to this important meeting, because it was an important meeting. In fact, it was for many indigenous peoples, it was a great occasion to be received at the United Nations platform, which also meant a recognition and a hope for their struggle for rights and justice. And so, in fact, I did make my presentation to this conference, in retrospect, that this conference in Geneva stood at the beginning of an interesting and positive development. And in retrospect, I'm very glad to have been a part of that process. I could not be present myself at that conference, in that meeting in Rotterdam, because I was in New York very much involved in matters relating to disappeared persons, and we were setting up and trying, because there was a lot of opposition, we were setting up a mechanism for accountability and of search and fact-finding. And so I was informed of the work done in Rotterdam, and I do know that it was an important piece of information in the whole process. And the timing was so important because we were in a stage at the United Nations of transition, and also in the world at large. We had first a pro-human rights, if I may say so, administration under President Carter, and then there was the Reagan, Ronald Reagan moved in, and they had a completely different approach on human rights, and different interests and different priorities. And I do think that from that perspective also the Rotterdam meeting, from holding that line which was about to develop, and so I still think that the timing of that conference in Rotterdam was also a very important, decisive message, and also on behalf of justice and rights and welfare of the indigenous peoples. The Rotterdam Tribunal played an important role in that direction, yes. In international life, it is always tempting to wait and see, and say we first have to see what this report, which was started in 1971, and let us first see the outcome of that report and then move on. Well, I was afraid, in fact, at that moment, that while this report was already nearly completed, and it was authored, formally speaking, by a special rapporteur of the United Nations, Martinez Cobo, but it was written by a man who was, I think, very much committed to the cause of the indigenous peoples. That was Mr. Augusto Willemsen Diaz. And Willemsen Diaz, I think, more than anyone else in my department, was the conscience and the heart of the indigenous peoples. And I would like also to mention in this respect that we were on a fact-finding mission in 1978 in Chile. And there, in fact, he was the one who found out, and through his contacts, that the Mapuche Indians had suffered more from the persecutions and from the cruelties of the Pinochet regime. So he opened the way also there, from that perspective, to see how we should deal with the Mapuche Indians in that situation. And but he was at the same time the author of that a 700 or 800 page report, because he was a very solid worker also at the same time. It was, I do think, it was out of true love and respect for the indigenous peoples. Yeah. Of course, they are not all the same. Of course, there is also a great deal of diversity, but we cannot only put them in one box. It was very moving when he said these indigenous peoples are God's most precious children, and I will never forget that. The time was, I think, was precious to act swiftly, and that was and my main associates in the Department for Human Rights, I think they agreed with me, and we agreed that we should move on and not wait ad calendas graecas. Well, I think that what has been achieved to a certain extent is that the plight of the indigenous peoples are on the agenda as one of the main issues of many treaty bodies. That is one thing. In fact, there has been a sort of mainstreaming and integration of the plight of indigenous peoples in a whole range of United Nations human rights organs. That is one thing. But that is in itself not enough, because then it may become also a sort of routine matter, and that is certainly not enough. Given already the experience gained in the past, I think this has to continue this process and also adapt it to contemporary conditions. But I do think it will be very useful to continue this process. Yes. The indigenous peoples, we can also appreciate and learn from their experience in a sort of multicultural society, because I do think that that approach, it is a learning approach also on our part, there to understand and to contribute particularly to a way of life that is not based on power and authority in autocratic means, but also on understanding and on based on appreciation and of their contribution to human life. I do believe that we, in mutual understanding and mutual appreciation, can go ahead and see also our future in a more in a more positive manner. I would like to say that I'm grateful that I could play this role, and I think we should not only be concerned about our own self-interest and self-service, but we should take responsibility for those who are the most vulnerable in society. And I do think that many of the indigenous peoples are still very vulnerable. And so there is still a long way to go. But there is hope that working together and through tribunals and other meetings, these issues are kept alive and are further developed.
We are also very grateful to Theo van Boven for all of his contributions, as well as all of the staff that he mentioned. The director of the United Nations Human Rights Division is now known today as the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So he mentioned many important people such as Augusto Diaz, Martinez Cobo, and that's really what this conference is looking at. When we commemorate 40 years of the Russell Tribunal, it's individuals who have united together to really impact initiatives that then have created institutions that then reflect the values of the indigenous peoples. And we are very honored to look at what's been done in those 40 years and what comes next. And Theo van Boven spent an entire lifetime doing just that. But we very much thank him for sharing those words to talk about how indigenous have impacted the international institutions and what steps we can take as we move forward into the future. I now would like to introduce Leo van der Vlies, the co-organizer of this amazing webinar and the director of the Netherlands Center for Indigenous Peoples. Leo.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And I can tell you that doing this interview with Professor van Boven was such a great pleasure. I mean, this guy is a real hero for me. And I hadn't seen him too often, although we live in the same country. And he was such a modest, kind man, 86 years old. We were received this apple pie, and it was just great to interview him and hear his views of this very important period that he happened to be sitting in a very crucial position at the United Nations. Anyway, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Tony Simpson of the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, because after all, without the collaboration of that foundation, we wouldn't have a fourth Russell Tribunal. And this foundation was already formed in 1963 to carry forward the Bertrand Russell's work for peace, human rights, and social justice. And Tony Simpson has been with that organization for a long time. Already in 1980, he was already with that organization, he told me. And he's now also the editor of the Spokesman, which is the journal of this foundation. So I'm looking forward to Tony's perspectives, which is also long-term perspective. Over to you, Tony.
Good evening from Nottingham. I'm grateful to Leo and to Natalie for reaching out to the Russell Foundation to participate in this welcome commemoration of the Fourth Tribunal. I joined the first webinar and was pleased to see vivid pictures of Ken Fleet, my colleague at the Russell Foundation, when he was addressing the tribunal 40 years ago. Sadly, Ken died in April, a victim of the COVID virus. I worked with him for 40 years, and for most of that time, the striking blue poster of the Fourth Russell Tribunal hung on the wall of his office. I remember him returning from Rotterdam with the tribunal handbook, which we still have, and later seeing the yellow report, the yellow covered report of the tribunal. At that time, in 1980, the Russell Foundation was busy launching the appeal for European nuclear disarmament, which convulsed much of Europe as it confronted the prospect of so-called limited nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union that was to be conducted in the European theatre. Nuclear disarmament was a key priority for Bertrand Russell in establishing his foundation, and it remains so today. Now we are reviving our work for European nuclear disarmament, which is given added point by the recent destruction of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and Russia. Of course, indigenous peoples in many corners of the world, including the Americas, suffer long-term consequences of nuclear weapons testing and manufacture, as people in Utah, the Marshall Islands, Australia, and elsewhere can testify. It's appropriate that the issues that gave rise to the fourth Russell Tribunal are revisited during these webinars. As we heard from Oren Lyons in the first session, the tribunal gave voice and platform to indigenous peoples. But the problems haven't gone away during the intervening decades. Illegal appropriations continue of the lands of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Attempted appropriations and destruction are resisted, often at great personal cost to the peoples engaged in the struggle. There is much cause still for the eagle and the condor to unite. The fourth tribunal left a rich legacy of materials, and it's encouraging that the archive will be digitized to widen access to these unique documents. The Russell Foundation strongly supports such efforts so that people may better know their own history. It is for such a purpose that the Russell Archives at McMaster University in Canada are engaged in documenting and interpreting Bertrand Russell's long and active life. In 18 months' time, in May 2022, it will be the 150th anniversary of Russell's birth. We're making preparations to celebrate the landmark anniversary, as Russell's popularity and appeal attracts new enthusiasts with new translations of his work into the languages of Kazakhstan, Albania, China, and into Spanish and other languages. Publication and translation is another fundamental way to give voice. And isn't it time that a book of the fourth Russell Tribunal was published? Surely it's long overdue. Since that tribunal met in 1980, much has happened. Ken Coates, my late colleague at the Russell Foundation, wrote in the handbook, "In the collective which works in the Indian project, we have found an exemplary group who are in no way likely to imagine that the forthcoming tribunal is an action sufficient in itself. The work they have already done will ensure that, rather, the tribunal will merely mark a new stage in widening of a much needed, much wanted campaign. The basis is there for the fourth tribunal to resume its work, if the means and personnel can again be found to sustain its autonomous existence. It is perhaps worth noting that the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, after it had completed its scheduled sessions, convened an extraordinary session in 2014, following Israel's bombardment of Gaza. It was a timely and well-informed intervention that heard first-hand testimony, although some invited participants were prevented from travelling to Brussels. Of course, the interval since 1980 is much greater, but the collective memory is there to inform the work of a renewed Fourth Tribunal in the era of climate change, as we heard from Winona LaDuke and Sarah James in the first webinar. Perhaps this renewal will grow out of the creative work now underway with this commemoration and the ongoing project to digitise the Tribunal archive. Ken Coates went on to become a member of the European Parliament and to chair its Human Rights Committee, which was constantly reminded of the problems of indigenous peoples. In 1994, he contributed a foreword to the book Indigenous Peoples and International Organisations, edited by Lydia van der Vliet and published by the Russell Foundation. Ken recalled the fourth Russell Tribunal and how later the UN designated 1993 as the year of the indigenous peoples. And then the thought arose that a year might not be quite enough to encompass all the necessary repentance. And so it came about that there was the decade of the indigenous peoples. But these periods are puny in the great span of time. The longevity and wisdom of indigenous peoples have much to teach the world, if only it will listen. People need to hear the voice which spoke clearly in Rotterdam 4 decades ago and continues to do so now as the climate changes. And as we heard from Sarah James in Alaska, the tree line advances northwards. We wish you well in your long journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you for the invitation to revisit the tribunal for real. And I can tell you that the name of Bertrand Russell attached to a tribunal has made a big difference. I read that in the archives. It helped raising funding. It helped getting media attention. So thank you very much. And we'll stay in touch.
Sure.
I now make a slight change in our program because we have the UN Special Rapporteur among us and he needs to leave soon. So instead of going to Stefano, we're going to Nilo to introduce the Special Rapporteur. Nilo, over to you.
Thank you, Leo. Okay, tengo el honor y el placer de presentar a una gran
Yes,
persona.
thank you, Leo. It is a great honor to present a dear brother who now is the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples. I've known Francisco for probably 30 years or more. He also had to go into exile and lived in the north and in Canada. I don't have his CV in front of me, but it's a very long CV, I assure you, and I wouldn't be able to read all of it anyway. He worked as part of the committee of the CERD, and he was also part of many organizations in Canada and Guatemala. And we've been together in many meetings and negotiations in the UN. So Francisco, now we have the great luck that you are the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we hope that the pandemic ends soon so we can hang out in person. But for the moment, I will give the floor to Francisco Cali, who is a dear brother to many of us. And we know you're very busy, and we're very grateful that you've taken a moment to take the floor and let us know what's happening in the world with regard to Indigenous peoples. Thank you so much for being with us, Francisco. Go ahead. Thank you so much, Nilo. It's such a pleasure to see brothers and sisters and friends, and Stefano, who's one of our elders and friends and allies in the struggle of Indigenous peoples. So I've got to run to another meeting in a second, but thank you so much for this opportunity. I just want to say that the situation in the world right now is not like it was in the 80s, but it is very grave in its own right. COVID-19 has ripped the veil off the reality of indigenous peoples. The racism, the racial discrimination, the assassination of our men and women leaders, criminalization, persecution, no social services, abandoned by the states. So we knew all of this was happening, but it wasn't as obvious as it is now. Right now, there is a tremendous need to join our voices with the clamor of indigenous peoples organizations, not just in Latin America, but in Asia and Africa. The extractive industries are pillaging indigenous peoples' territories with the excuse that they've lost money during the pandemic and now have to make up for lost time. And they are harming indigenous peoples. We're the ones who received less support and medical attention during the pandemic. I think Nick Tilson is going to speak later. He's been persecuted for defending land rights and the rights to territory of indigenous peoples and the right to protest and the right to health care. More than ever before, we need a new fourth Russell Tribunal. We need urgently a new tribunal to hear the voice of indigenous peoples. Yes, it's true, there are several different mechanisms of the United Nations dedicated to indigenous peoples. There's the expert group, and there's the permanent forum, and there's a special rapporteur. But indigenous peoples need to make their own voice heard, because the clamor of indigenous peoples who are denouncing all of this suffering and injustice is not being heard. So I urge our old friends and allies to support us in this initiative. I will support this initiative. The situation of indigenous peoples in the world is very dire right now. We need to come together and make the indigenous people's voices heard about what they're suffering. I'm seeing lots of old friends. I celebrate you, I honor you, and I thank you. And I thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Francisco. Just a quick question. What's going to happen in the UN with all of the meetings that were programmed and that have been canceled because of the pandemic? This is a step backwards because we need to denounce a bunch of cases. So what's going to happen? My understanding is that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is organizing regional meetings. Next week, the Permanent Forum from December 7th to is going to meet, but you have to sign up to speak. The expert mechanism on indigenous peoples began today. Today there was a consultation with Africa and North America. And if I'm not mistaken, Next week, there's going to be the meeting of Latin America. So I'll send you the calendar of the consultation so that you can get the word out and the brothers and sisters that want to participate can. Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much. Pancho, thanks for being with us. If anybody wants to participate in those meetings, you need to write up. My email is Francisco Cali, relator especial at gmail.com. So he's going to write it in the chat so you can write to me and we can be in touch, and I'd be happy to respond to any inquiry. So thank you so much, Francisco Cali. There's my email. Big hug to each and every one of you. So I'm going to hand it back to Leo, who is going to introduce Stefano. I'm sorry that we had to jump around in the agenda a bit, but it was very important to hear from the new UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples who took up the mantle from Victoria Taulu Corpus. So, Stefano, Joshua, did you finish your presentation?
Yes, I was finished, and it's now on to our next exciting speakers.
Yeah, Nilo, you can just continue introducing Stefano because he was planned before Francisco. So we pick it up there and then we move on as planned. Thank you.
Ok, gracias. Bueno, ahora vamos a presentar a Stefano Valese muy corto. Stefano tiene una...
So I'm going to introduce Stefano. He has 40, 50, 60 years working with indigenous peoples. He's an anthropologist from Peru. He lived in many countries and Mexico. Oops. A couple of books and many articles. I don't have his CV in front of me, but he was one of the founders of the Barbados Declaration, which had a lot of resonance in the world and also with indigenous peoples. I called for an end to paternalisms, including the paternalism of anthropologists, and critique them for using indigenous peoples for years. So it was a decolonizing declaration that had a tremendous impact on civil society. And he was a professor in Davis, California, and founder of organizations and networks. His CV is too long to read, but welcome, Stefano Varese. And we send our condolences for the tragedy of your granddaughter, and we thank you very much for being with us now, and we hope we can count on you to help organize the next 4th Russell Tribunal. Thank you, Nilo, and thank you to all of the panelists. The tragedy of my granddaughter is a symbol of the tragedies of this world and the world that we live in, where there's more weapons than people. And unfortunately, those weapons are used to maim and kill and destroy. What Nilo asked me to do is to talk a bit about possibilities for the future in the context of our celebration. Barbados won had some of the same actors as the Fourth Russell Tribunal, like Guillermo Bonfil. But the discussion opened our eyes about the complexity of the indigenous world, which was under attack by the governments and by the right and by the left, but was also being attacked by missionaries and efforts to convert them to Christianity, and they were being attacked by the private sector and scientists, social scientists. Anthropology had been an ally of recolonizing and continuing the original colonialism. So the Barbados Declaration had quite an impact. It was burned by the military junta of Paraguay, and we compiled the documentation and all the cases that were denounced. The English version survived in a precarious form in a publication in Switzerland, but it was such a powerful document that the fascists burnt it, at least in the Spanish version. But a couple of pages were even translated into indigenous languages and had quite an impact. The legal analysis on the defense of indigenous people's rights has been cited. Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that some consider is not legally binding, as well as other international instruments, show us that there has been some progress in the legal framework. For example, in Nicaragua, the sentence of Awastingi was one of the first legal triumphs that was presented by somebody who went on to be indigenous representative, James Anaya, yes, who was the first UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, and he was the lawyer that defended the indigenous community of Awastingi in Nicaragua on before the Inter-American Human Rights Court of the Organization of American States. So all of these triumphs are part of the long red road of the indigenous struggle, which has used the courts and international law of the white man, of the colonists, for the struggle for justice. We have the case of Standing Rock in South Dakota, where thousands of indigenous peoples from all over the Americas joined in a people's uprising that forced the Obama administration to take action, which unfortunately was overturned by the Trump administration, which is part of the tides of politics. Anyway, what do we need to do now? What is the possible follow-up to the fourth Russell Tribunal and the success and headway we've made in the international arena? What awaits us in the future for the struggle of indigenous peoples? And what can we as allies who aren't indigenous can do, who struggle for indigenous peoples? I'd like to just say that the struggle of indigenous peoples for the world and for humanity and the animals and the water and the air is the struggle of all of us. It's not just indigenous people's job to defend nature and the world. Obviously, indigenous peoples have values and ethics that teach us that what we're defending is not just the material manifestation of nature, but the spirit of nature and life. And we're saying no to destruction. So what kind of follow-up can we conceive of to the fourth tribunal?
Benefit a little bit more. My suggestion would be to link the continuation of the Russell Tribunal to what we are trying to set up for 2021, next year, toward November, December, if COVID is under control somehow. We are planning to celebrate or commemorate the Barbados I meeting in Ecuador, in Quito. We already have the kind of semi-offer by the Universidad Católica to host indigenous leaders, social scientists, activists into a major meeting to evaluate the situation of the indigenous people of the Americas, from Alaska to Argentina to Tierra del Fuego, and rekindle the fire of mobilization. So maybe one possibility would be to organize some sort of joint meeting, either online or in real presence, of celebrating, commemorating the Barbados I meeting and commemorating the new Russell Tribunal to be built as a permanent institution. And the idea would be that maybe we should fantasize or believe or imagine a network of institution, individual, community, indigenous, most of them, that would keep an eye on what is happening in Indian land, in Indian country, all over the Americas, but not only the Americas, all over the world in indigenous territory, what is happening and how to denounce in real time, immediately, through the satellite system, the internet system, immediately denounce what is happening and put it in front of the eyes of the world as a scandalous continuation of colonialism, neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, and postmodern colonialism, whatever definition we want to have of this new phenomena of increasing the destruction of Indian people, Indian land. So it would be a global network activated by this wonderful technology that we now have access to. And that will be a kind of scandalous, immediate manifestation in real time of what is happening to Indian country, to indigenous people all over the world. Maybe it's a far-fetched fantasy that I develop in these days of the Russell Tribunal celebration, or maybe something that we could achieve. As one of the original members of Barbados One, I am actively participating in the organization of the Barbados One celebration in Quito, Ecuador, and now as member of this wonderful Russell Tribunal celebration, I'm also part of this group. So I offer my energy to see if we can structure this network and these links. This is my modest contribution today. I don't know if Nilo expected something else from me or something more, but this would conclude.
Mucho, mucho más de ti esperamos. No, está bien, por ahora está bien, Estefan. Muy bueno lo que dijiste. Bueno, no sé si hay algo más que agregar.
Oh, that was great.
¿Sí? ¿Estás ahí, Hortensia?
If that, yes, I'm here, says Hortensia. Well, thank you and welcome to our webinar. You have a fascinating resume. Forgive me, I'm not going to read all of it because we don't have enough time. Hortensia is from northern Chile, and she works with an indigenous communication and research center that's called CHAS, Kenya Rampi, and she also works with the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network. She has done a great deal of work at the United Nations in the climate change negotiations and other arenas of indigenous diplomacy. Climate change is a product of the irresponsible use of natural resources, especially fossil fuels, which results in global warming. Anyway, Hortensia is also an advisor of an organization that is the International Indigenous Biodiversity Forum, which has a consultative status with the Convention on Biological Diversity. She was studying the university for a number of years, but now she is once again in her community, and she works closely with other indigenous peoples like the Mapuches and our brothers and sisters from Rapa Nui. Hortensia, we're all overjoyed that the Chilean people have risen up. We're particularly impressed by the vigor and struggle of the Chilean youth who are in the streets demanding a transformation of the racist society. And we know Hortensia has been in the streets as well. And thank you so much for joining us. You have the floor. Greetings from northern Chile, from the Aymara people. It's been really important to have had the opportunity to listen to you all today, because I've learned a great deal about the seed that was planted with the fourth Russell Tribunal. And obviously it was crucial that the Russell Tribunal provided a platform for calling out the states. Here in Chile, there's no recognition of indigenous peoples in the Constitution. And we've had a really tough fight to defend our territories. And indigenous women have played a fundamental role. We are the guardians of our traditional knowledge, and we teach our children about that traditional knowledge and culture as we struggle against extractive industries. The indigenous peoples who live in Chile suffer constant human rights violations and violations to our right to land and territory, and there's constantly trying to erase us and invisibilize us, when they've been trying to do that for centuries. It's characteristic of colonialism. And the constitution that Chile has currently was drafted by Pinochet, and it is also crafted to facilitate the neoliberal model of so-called development, which really consists of plundering. So nosotros, we are not just defending indigenous peoples and our territories, we're also defending Mother Earth. And so fortunately, the Chilean civil society has finally realized how important indigenous peoples' territories are, and all of the nature that we're defending. And so they've joined with us. And last year on October 18th, we started the popular uprising. And this October, we had a referendum about whether we were going to draft a new constitution or not. And we won the referendum. So now we're going to embark on the process of drafting a new constitution, and indigenous peoples want to participate in that process and redefine and refound the Chilean state as a multicultural state. Unfortunately, the government is blocking the Constituent Congress and the inclusion of indigenous peoples' rights in the new constitution. So this is the current situation in Chile. Human rights are being violated, indigenous people's rights to our territories are being violated, but there's also very brutal repression in the streets against the protesters, against the people. There has been a lot of injustice. A lot of protesters have lost their eyes. There's been sexual and gender violence committed by the security forces. And we are far from achieving justice. So in the last couple of years, we've had very capitalist governments, in contrast to Bolivia, which had an indigenous brother, Evo Morales, as president. But there was recently a coup d'etat against him. I was recently in Brazil, in Bolivia, for the new elections, which reaffirmed indigenous people's dignity and the project of the plurinational and multicultural states. In Colombia, we see that there's the Minga or uprising. In Peru, there's also uprising. So throughout Latin America, we're seeing the people are rising up against capitalist governments and rising up against the destruction of our natural resources. So we are reuniting, we are joining hands, and we're once again forging alliances with indigenous peoples and peoples in other countries throughout Latin America. But at the same time, we continue to suffer persecution and criminalization and smear campaigns against leaders and protesters. The repression has been truly brutal, especially against the Mapuche people. The perspective of indigenous women is that we need to continue to build capacity so that the headway we've made in the international arena can translate into progress at the national level, like the new constitution that we want in Chile. So we're struggling so that the right to self-determination, which is enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, be included in the Chilean constitution. We want Chile to, well, they did ratify Convention 169 of the ILO, but it's not implemented or respected. And I want to say a few words about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic in Chile. Indigenous peoples in Chile have been severely impacted, especially in northern Chile. A lot of indigenous peoples have passed, but the government hasn't taken the most minimum measures to protect our territories. Chile is renowned as the jaguar of Latin America, but that is to say that it's much more developed than other countries of Latin America. But the truth is that in indigenous communities, a lot of communities don't have drinking water or don't have running water to wash their hands, which is so necessary during the pandemic. And so what we've been doing is to revitalize our traditional medicine to heal ourselves from the virus, and we continue to exercise our self-determination, and in this regard, we have sealed off our territories during the pandemic to protect our people. We've been in our homes almost for the entire year, and we're all tapped out economically, especially the indigenous peoples. But we're tough and we're resilient, and regardless of, you know, the adverse impacts of climate change or the pandemic, we're still here and we're still struggling and trying to strengthen our people and build strategic alliances to help us defend our territories. And we are confident that we are going to draft a new constitution that does recognize indigenous peoples and does enshrine our rights as indigenous peoples, and that we will refound the Chile as a multinational, pluricultural state. And thank you to our elders and all of you who organized and participated in the 4th Russell Tribunal. And we thank you, Hortensia. We're running out of time, but I did wanted to say that the Mapuche people is also transboundary. They're found in Chile and Argentina, and we're also struggling against elite and pretty much a feudal system. And there's a lot of human rights violations and evictions in Argentina. So we have to do some more work for our future generations. I'm going to turn it over to Jose Barrero. How you doing, Nilo? Nice to see you. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Nick Tilson, who's a brother who's been with us in a lot of historic meetings. And I was with him in New York, and I had the pleasure of visiting with him a couple of times. So obviously we need to organize more tribunals and continue to share this history with the youth. Jose, back to you.
Creo que la traducción se hace un poco más fácil en general.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in English.
I'll switch to English for presenting a representative of the young generation, the people of the plains of the United States, Lakota, Oglala Lakota, a young man who has taken up the struggle. I'm speaking of Nick Tilson, who's a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation, who has been involved in the struggles of recent years, particularly with Standing Rock and the explosion of resistance to the pipelines and the intrusions in Indian country, the destruction of water, and the destruction of native territories. The young people have taken up the cause. Not too long ago, we were told elders were concerned that the young people were not necessarily picking up their own culture. And that's no longer true. The young people are really coming on very strong. and are presenting the continuity that we're talking about. We're continuity of what we're doing with this tribunal and this tribute, and the continuity of the generations. What I particularly like about Nick Tilson and why I presented him, even though he's very busy these days with his leadership, and he also has serious federal charges on him for a protest in the Black Hills of South Dakota on the July 4th miss celebrations there by the president. But he is an organizer, not only in the resistance to the aggressions, but he's also a builder. I'll start with this quote from him, and then I'll turn it over to Nick Tilson, who I should also say, I know his family for a long time. He comes from one of those struggling families, as we have seen in several occasions here, of the next generation. I know his father, I knew his grandfather, I knew his great-grandmother, Meridel Lesueur, who is a famous and well-known resister herself, a poet and a woman leader from her generation. So he said this at one point, and I would remind him of this before I turn it to him. At this moment, he said, it is easy to talk about what we are fighting for as just resistance. But we are not just fighting against a system, we are building a new one. Nick Tilson, if you're on, please come on and tell us a little bit about your present struggles, your people, and your sacred Black Hills.
Hamadakiapi, Nick Tilson Amachiapi, Chante Washte Napechuzapalo. I greet you in my Lakota language, calling in here from my home community here on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and I'm a father of four, and my mother is Joanne Tall. My father is Mark Tilson, and it's just an honor to be here with each and every one of you. And I wanted to thank Jose for the invite. I'm humbled to be before some of the names that I see on the screen, and I want to start by saying that the work that we're doing now has been built on the foundation that all of you have built, that all of you have contributed to, and has paved a path forward for us as a people. And I had the benefit of growing up in my ceremonies. I had a benefit of growing up in the sun dance ceremonies and growing up in these ways because my parents' generation and because of your generation fought for those rights. And I always remind that to my peers and to our generation, because I want us to make sure that we understand that the sacrifices that have come before for us to be able to fight the way that we fight today. And so I wanted to acknowledge that, acknowledge Jose and Oren Lyons and Nilo and a lot of the names on here. And I got to meet some of you, whenever the very first permanent forum on Indigenous issues happened, the late Tony Blackfeather, I must have been about 19 years old or something. He dragged me, he dragged me to New York City. I didn't know nothing about any of this international stuff. But he had me writing and all kinds of stuff, and I remember all of his teachings. He taught me about some of these functions. So I got to grow up in this way, and my parents met in the American Indian movement in 1973. That's where my family came together down here in Wounded Knee. And so I was definitely raised up through the American Indian movement. And now, my work has been really about nation building and nation defending. I seen an email from Jose, and I remember that got ingrained into me at a young age from hearing the conversations of that. We have to build the very future that we're fighting for as we're fighting for it. We can't just hope that it gets there. And so my work, I started as an organizer when I was 17 years old and have spent my whole life, since that time organizing in my community. And here on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, I had the opportunity to build a community from scratch called Thunder Valley. And you can find out more about it at thundervalley.org. But it was the epitome of self-determination, that there was nobody to ask to build housing for our people, to grow our own food, to save our indigenous languages, to do some of the things that we need to do. And it took us about 12 years, but a bunch of ragtag sun dancers from Pine Ridge and Porcupine, lo and behold, we built a whole community from scratch. And we always admitted what we didn't know in doing that work. We always reached out to our elders. We made ourselves be students and humbled ourselves to be able to learn. And none of us wanted to be developers, but we learned affordable housing development. We learned about renewable energy. We learned about all of these things. And a lot of us, when we started that work, we were becoming young parents for our first time. And that's what was the motivator for us. We used to say, and I'll share this short story and I'll get into the modern stuff that we're going to talk about, but we were sitting outside of the Inipi or the sweat lodge, and we were complaining about the way that our res is. And we were talking about how Pine Ridge is always talked about as like the worst, right? We have the worst poverty, the worst whatever. And so we were sitting outside of the sweat lodge, and we kind of got into complaining about the way the res is. Our tribal government should do this, the government should honor the treaties, all these things we got into complaining. And then we went into the Inipi, into the sweat lodge. And in that ceremony, the ancestors came in there and they chewed us out the same way a grandma or grandpa would chew you out. And they said, how long are you going to let other people to decide the future for your children? Are you not warriors? And they said, it's time to stop talking and start doing, and to come from a place of fear, or come from a place of hope, not from a place of fear. And that became the catalyst for the work that we did at Thunder Valley. And through a short period of time, we became a big employer. We started shifting the narrative. We started changing a place that was really hard to change. And in the process of doing that, tribal leaders from about 70 different indigenous nations reached out to us, wanting to do something similar to what we were doing at Thunder Valley, but within the context of their own culture and climate and spirit of place. I was like, well, first of all, we're barely pulling this idea off. But second of all, we have very little capacity to show support. And eventually I wanted to create something. I wanted to create something that could change the entire dynamics in the way in which indigenous self-determination work is supported. And so that's when I created the organization called the Indian Collective, which is the organization that I run now. And Indian Collective is just slang. It's slang. Like there's no acronyms. I was in too many meetings with too many acronyms to think about having acronyms. So Indian is just straight up slang for Indian. The Indian Collective, and we're slowly becoming the largest grant-making organization in the history of philanthropy, and we only fund indigenous-led efforts. And we also do grassroots organizing, because we said that we don't want to be intermediaries, we don't want to be middlemen or middle people, but we want to build the collective power of indigenous people. And so we have a whole organizing arm that organizes around racial equity, that organizes around climate justice, that organizes around racial equity, education equity, climate justice, and our new campaign called Land Back, that we're fighting for indigenous lands back into indigenous hands at all and any means necessary. And so in this work, it was important for us that as we're grant makers and sort of, sustainable entrepreneurs, that we're also frontline activists willing to stand up to protect our lands and the very future that we're actively building. And so, when President Trump came to our lands without the free and prior informed consent of our tribal leaders, we wanted to center the struggle for the Black Hills and the struggle for the honoring of our treaties and the struggle for the human rights of our people at a time in this country where there was an actual conversation happening about racial reckoning, and that we couldn't really truly have a conversation about reparations in this nation. And you know, as statues of symbols of white supremacy begin to topple around the United States, here we have Mount Rushmore right in the Black Hills. It is, and you know, and so we use this not as a way to protest Trump, but as a way to catalyze and recenter that struggle. And as a boy, I grew up in those meetings. I grew up sitting on the ground in those treaty meetings in Storm Mountain, at Barrett View, at these different places. And so we you know, we held space there, and we began to shift the narrative, and we got lots of young people. And as a result of taking the stand that we took there, you know, the area was turned into a complete militarized zone. The National Guard was called in on us, and we were there was 20 of us that were arrested, and the rest of the fellow land defenders, my relatives, were all charged with misdemeanors. But sort of textbook, they decided they wanted to come after somebody, and so they came after me and charged me with over four state felonies and 3 misdemeanors, and I'm currently, you know, facing up to 16.5 years in prison for participating in allegedly blocking a road and allegedly stealing a police shield, but really standing in resistance on my own land that I was taught to do since I was a little boy. And so, you know, that's kind of where the struggle is at right now. And, you know, I don't expect the court system in the United States to provide justice, you know, to us. But we're doing what we can, because the stance that we made, it's egregious actually, that of how much they're overcharging in this particular situation. And but also they're very afraid of what Indian Collective represents, because we are a national organization, and in the past 30 months we've raised over $50 million to transform and invest into Indigenous self-determination and to dismantle white supremacy. And our headquarters is in the Black Hills, and our headquarters is in a sacred Chisapa. And so it's not just me, obviously, that they're targeting the idea of Indigenous self-determination and progress. And so, you know, that's kind of the current state of things, of holding this balance of defending and developing at the same time. And so, you know, when I sit in meetings like this, I'm very it gives me courage, because I know that there's a lot of stories of every single person on this call that have fought in places and put many things at risk, but have come out on the other side of it. And so as I sit here as a younger person, my kids would laugh if anybody called me young, by the way, but you know, I went to a treaty meeting off the hill in Porcupine here, and one of our elders, Richard Brokenose, he called me a boy, and my kids thought that was pretty funny. But I want to say that understanding a part in some of all of your struggles and the foundation that you laid for our generation really gives me deep courage, and I call upon that when I think about what the future looks like, and what I'm personally being faced with, and what my people are being faced with. And it reminds me to have absolutely zero regrets, because we knew exactly what we were doing and exactly what we're fighting for, and because that was passed down to us, and that we're going to continue to build that communities of tomorrow, and we're going to continue to fight the system, because it's not just building the communities of tomorrow, but how can we build the communities of tomorrow while still dismantling the very system that creates injustice today. So I wanted to say that much at this time, and say that it's an honor to to be with everybody. And I know in about 5 minutes I have to get off because of I have to meet with the lawyers and the Treaty Council here about some legal strategies. But I wanted to say that much for now, and I don't know if we have time for questions or not.
Probably not at this point for questions, Nick. We have a tight program, but thanks a lot. That was a very thorough account of what's going on, and it's really inspiring to see this next generation. I used to run with his father when we organized the Black Hills Alliance back in the late 70s, early 80s. I remember these kids are babies. We throw them in the back seat and take off to do our work, you know. So they grew up in it. They really grew up in it. And just take care of yourself, son. And we're behind you. You know, we don't want to see you put away, man. We need you on the outside. So we're going to be behind you all the way. You know, go home. All the best to you. No.
Thank you.
Nilo? ¿Qué tal? Está nuestro amigo Dat Neva. No te oigo.
No, digo, vamos a terminar porque no hay más tiempo. Lamentamos que el hermano...
Unfortunately, our brother from Panama didn't manage to connect. Unfortunately, our brother from Colombia was unable to connect as well. I mean, Colombia is really in very dire situation for indigenous peoples. Over 500 years, and things are pretty much about the same. So obviously we see that the youth are carrying the torch forward, and we're going to continue to meet and see how we can organize another tribunal. Stefano was saying that maybe we can join in the 40th anniversary of the Barbados Declaration, but we'll talk about all of that anon. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas really do need a new tribunal. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Jose so that he can introduce Oren Lyons. Oh, hi, I was the photographer for the tribunal. Oh, thank you for being with us.
Muy bien, Nilo. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Nilo. And thank you again. I'm glad to see that you're hanging in with us for a few more minutes. It was really a pleasure to introduce the young activists, you know, what's coming. And it's even more of a pleasure to introduce for the second time Oren Lyons, Onondaga elder, who is 90 years old this year, and who started in this work over 50 years ago, and who has been the epitome of consistency of his word, of the messages of the elders that he's carried all these years, willing to enter into any situation to carry the philosophy of peace, of the great law of peace. From Wounded Knee in 1973, that was the delegation that went in there, to other times when there have been instances of violence and potential war, even in the case in Nicaragua with the Sandinista fight with the Mosquito people at that time, and with the complexity of that case, the difficulty that presented for progressive movements. And the effort was wonderful to see the Haudenosaunee, led by Oren Lyons, partake of that process and help to create the dialogue that led to peace in that region at that time. So thank you, Needle, for your introduction of me. I am from the Antilles, and I am a member of the Taino Nation of the Antilles. And our nation is coming back together. It's been coming back together. There are many thousands of us, many thousands, and it took us a long time to gather our forces and ourselves, but a lot of solidarity coming from the Taino people of the Caribbean. And now I'd like to invite Oren Lyons, faith keeper, elder, longtime voice of this movement, to give us his closing words. Oren? Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm still in the pencil and paper era. It's technology I stay away from. Nevertheless, it's important today because that's our base of communication right now. Without this technology, we wouldn't be able to meet. Well, it's invigorating. It's invigorating to see, especially the young man from Pine Ridge. And Pine Ridge is an old stomping ground for us guys. I've been there a long time ago, and we have many of the leaders of those times passed on. And going back to 1980, when we had the meeting, you know, the Fourth World Congress, and that was 40 years have passed, and they passed pretty fast as far as I'm concerned. Time is accelerating, and things have taken place. We've gained some ground, but basically, I hear the complaints that came across. Those complaints are very, very old. They're very consistent. Whether they're coming from Canada, whether they're coming from the USA, whether they're coming from Central or South America, the complaints remain the same because the issue remains the same. And the battle has always been over land. It's always land is the issue. And there have been many ways that the invaders, I would say the immigrants who came across on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and brought pestilence with them, and brought violence with them. They brought genocide. They destroyed hundreds of thousands of our people. They hunted them down with dogs. They amputated legs and hands and noses and arms. A terrible history. And all in the name of God. Christianity invaded the Western Hemisphere. Our people have been subjected to these terrible killings, flat out killings, clearings of lands, clear the people, clear the original people before you can occupy, or put them in prisons, put them in these establishments they called reservations. And they policed these reservations. And one couldn't leave these reservations. And so the history of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere has never really been told. We hear much about the history of our Black brothers and sisters who were brought here as slaves. We hear much about them. And the reason why, one of the reasons why they're able to talk about them in the manner they do is they don't hold title to land. But indigenous nations and people hold title to land. And that puts us in a different category. And the issue of how do you colonize, how do you take land from people in a way that would be, you would call legal or civilized, or I don't know, whatever words you want to use. However, it's with violence that our lands have been taken. And we've stood our ground. And I was smiling when the young man was talking from Lakota country. The spirit is there. And, you know, Nilo and all of us older guys, we don't have the strength that we used to have. We're not as quick on our feet as we used to be, but our spirit has never waned. Our spirit is still there, full strength, full on. And so it was a pleasure really to listen to this young man, to hear his spirit and see how he is standing up. And I could understand when Broken Nose called him a boy, because I would do the same thing. To me, he's just a very young boy. But when you get to be our age, well, everybody's young. But in this conversation and in the closing words, I was been thinking over a period of time what brought us to Rotterdam, what brought us to that meeting, and the issues remain the same. And in some cases, it's gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. And listening to Sharon Van and people who have been in the trenches of legal discussions, it remains the same. And one reason why it remains the same is because our peoples have not given up. Our people still stand. That's why. That's why they stand in front of a pipeline, stand in front of a road, stand in any intrusion, our people will still stand. And that's why these continue, because we continue to fight. And it will go on. It will go on. I see one generation after the next. And I just, certain events, you know, as I reflect on why we went there, why we was the injustice that was visited upon all of our nations, our people. That's why we had the Fourth Russell Tribunal to speak out about these injustices. And what would be different today is that we're sitting in isolation right now because of COVID-19. We're sitting in isolation right now because the earth is speaking out in a very loud voice. And this voice is carrying across the whole globe as a pandemic, a virus that they cannot deal with at the moment. And there's another pandemic and virus waiting right behind this one. And there's another one behind that one. One of the things that I've seen over a period of my years and been watching, literally been watching very carefully, is the overpopulation of the earth itself by human beings. In 1950, that's 70 years ago, I was 20 years old. And there were 2.5 billion people in the world. And it took a million years to get there, to reach that level of population of human beings. And in 70 years, we've almost tripled the population to 7.7 billion today, soon to be 8. That's nature. You're not going to control that. That's nature, because we're nature. And we've been given the responsibility of intellect. Among all the creatures of the world, the human species has an intellect. And we are supposed to exercise that intellect on behalf of generations coming. This, at least, is in the philosophy of our peoples here in what they call North and South and Central America. We look to the future, and we are supposed to be taking care of those people coming in the future. Our brother from across the sea doesn't think that way. He doesn't have a concern for the future. And in that process, he has literally gutted the world. He has plundered the earth itself. He has dug gold, and he has dug all of these amazing strengths that are in the earth itself and exposed them and used them. And they are now being depleted. And of course, in that process, he has polluted the very air we breathe and the systems. And therefore, we have created an existential crisis of our very existence as a species. It's a question now. In the seventh generation perspective that our leaders have always followed, it's a mandate. It's a mandate. Step carefully with your feet, look to the future, and make all of your decisions on behalf of those generations coming, so they will have and enjoy what you have today. That perspective is not carried on by our brothers from across the water. He has a different thought. And the consequence of that is where we are right now. And so, as we have very altered, the very systems of the earth, we have changed that. We have polluted the air that we breathe to the point of our own extinction. And we have also violated the trust of the intellect that we were supposed to have, and we are supposed to protect the future. That intellect. The human species has this intellect, which gives us a huge responsibility for life. The other knowledge that we have is a foreknowledge of death. We know at a rather early age that at some point we are going to pass on and die. And with that knowledge, you have to prepare. And generally speaking, we have. But that doesn't occur anymore. That knowledge, that preparation, concern for the seventh generation, fading. And in the process, the explosion of human species. I was reflecting on John Mohawk as he was speaking as a young man. I was reflecting on a conversation we had, among many conversations, when we were talking somewhat about this, and John says, well, as far as I can see, the human species is still a biological experiment. The earth can live without us without any problem whatsoever, and has. We're relatively a new species if you want to go by the timeline of the earth itself. We haven't been here this long, and there's no reason for us to be here any longer. And so our fate is in our hands. We're the ones that control that. And so we have to look at our brother and we have to say to him, it's not too late to wake up, but it's getting close. We're approaching a point of no return. Okay, so that's coming soon. And they are waking. I've heard these voices now. I mean, I'm getting calls from around the world, from different places, and some influential people saying, what was it that you Indian people keep talking about? Now they're reaching back to our wisdom. They're reaching back to our values. They sense their own destruction. And the fear is out there now. And so what is it? What is these instructions, you know? Respect. Respect, a huge instruction. Respect is a law.
How much longer?
Hmm?
How much longer?
Not very much.
You gotta let me know I can't get anything. I'm shut off over here.
Okay.
So I gotta get on there.
Okay, so we have another meeting coming up right within this few minutes, so I don't have much more time to speak, but I will urge all of us to continue that struggle that we have been in for all these years. And the situation will always be there for us to challenge. Hopefully our brother is going to wake up to his own demise and change his ways. There is change in the air now, and we have to take full advantage of it. And we have to respond to those people reaching out to us. The values of peace. Peace is the number one value. And so now I will close my conversation here and urge us all to stand and to support that young voice that we just heard, and to educate those young people as to the values that have carried us this far. Peace, equity, fairness to the people, and the creation itself. So with that, I'll close and thank you all for your hard work and much more coming. So let's stand and fight. Done it.